And again, this was one of the things that I used to think about when I say the attractions and entertainment industry, was that it was, I kind of felt that it was both possibly unimaginative or didn't actually go to the extremes or probe the edges. And the more I interacted with people in the industry, I suddenly realized, no, that's not what's going on here. They're actually way better than I imagined. They're actually crafting something which will appeal to the 95th percentile.
Welcome to the AttractionPros podcast, where we discuss the latest trends and challenges facing the attractions industry today.
We chat with some of the top leaders in the field and provide resources that will help develop your career in this great industry.
I am Josh Liebman. I am obsessed with the guest experience and helping attractions make that their top priority for success.
And I'm Matt Heller. I am passionate about organizational effectiveness, leadership development, and employee engagement.
Now sit upright, hold on tight, and get ready for the AttractionPros podcast. Calling all thrill makers, fun creators, and attraction pros.
Get ready for the ride of a lifetime at IAAPA Expo 2023, the global attractions industry's premier event.
Join us in Orlando, November 13th to the 17th for a week of learning, networking, and exploring trends and new technologies.
Discover innovative solutions for growth that will supercharge your business and enhance your career.
Register by November 10th at IAAPA.org/IAAPA Expo. That's IAAPA.org/IAAPA EXPO to save up to 30% and get an additional $10 off with the code APROS. That's APROS.
We'll be there, and we hope to see you too. Hey, Josh, how are you?
Hey, Matt, I'm doing great. How are you?
I am thrilling-tastic.
You put a word in the middle of the word there.
I did. And it has everything to do with our conversation today and my question for you.
Okay.
If I were to ask you to define the word thrill, how would you define that?
I wouldn't define it nearly as well as Brendan Walker, I'll tell you. But if I were not thinking about this amazing interview with him, it would probably have the word adrenaline in it. It would probably be like heart racing. It would probably have some sort of like anxiety type emotion, but not necessarily in a bad way. When I think of roller coasters, I think of thrill. When I think of a haunted house, I think of thrill. When I think of, I don't know, someone bungee jumping, not me, not yet. Whitewater rafting. Yeah.
Yeah.
What about you?
The first word that comes to mind for me is excitement.
Okay.
Which all those things that you just mentioned, roller coaster, bungee jumping, all that, I would imagine for the right people would be exciting. But I would also imagine for many people it could be terrifying, but that's also maybe part of the thrill, part of the emotion. And today we really get to, I would say, dissect the concept of not only the emotional impact of an attraction, but creating the emotion and the formula behind that. When I think about my days of playing Roller Coaster Tycoon, I just wanted to make the biggest, tallest, fastest roller coaster I could, not thinking about what goes on from an emotional standpoint when people are riding it and all of those factors that you have to take into consideration.
This interview, I'm not trying to artificially inflate our stats here, but this is one where you're going to have to listen to multiple times. It is, you and I both are just like aggressively taking notes. Like I can go back and like take way more notes, like just listening back to it. Brendan Walker is a professor. So that is an important point to note. He is also the founder director of Studio Go-Go and Thrill Laboratory, and he is a thrill engineer. And he shares his backstory on how he got into the theme park business, which is kind of a funny story actually on his perception of the theme park industry before coming into the industry. And, he shares with us so much of the process of what goes into creating a thrilling experience. And there's so much granularity in it. I know we love using the word granular, and Brendan used it a couple of times here too.
Yes.
That gets very specific into walking us through what that looks like.
And one of the things I found fascinating from a human behavior perspective, when I'm talking to leaders and I'm coaching people, so often we're talking about emotions and how people feel about things, but I've never gotten to the level and the depth that Brendan gets into when he talks about actually designing experiences that will create a specific emotion. And that to me was absolutely fascinating, just kind of trying to understand how we, again, kind of go through those experiences and how it might affect you differently than it might affect me.
Yeah. And he talks about the formula too. And we're not going to give, too much away here. Honestly, I don't think either of us would be able to do it justice anyway. But when you think of thrill, you think of something that, that is kind of intangible and kind of abstract. But he said, no, there's the formula for thrill. It can actually be quantified. He walks us through what that looks like.
Yeah. He also talked about failing positively and the concept that, yes, you want to go in and have a good time, but there may be also these opportunities to, kind of go to the edge and feel what that's like. And again, he's going to explain it much better than I ever could, since I've just heard it. But he really talks about so many different things and so many different emotions and how we create those and how we experience those. It was fascinating.
Mm-hmm. One of I think my biggest takeaways is he said, when people walk into a theme park, there's basically an unwritten contract of the guest is saying, I trust you, right? I'm turning myself over to you. You're going to take me to the edge from that thrill standpoint, but I know that there's a lot of the work and that, that you've done to sort it all out and figure it all out. So yes, I'm going to go beyond my comfort zone today, knowing that, yeah, it'll be okay in the end.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So should we step outside of our comfort zone, take some more notes, and get to this interview with Brendan?
Let's do it. Hey, Brendan, welcome to the Attraction Pros podcast. We are so excited to have you on today. How are you?
Very good, thanks. Great to see you, Josh. And well, and Matt, of course. I mean, I can see you on the screen as well, Matt. There's no secret there, is there?
Glad the tech is working.
Yeah.
So, Brendan, you are a thrill engineer. What does that mean? Tell us about yourself and what you do.
Oh, my word. I mean, that's like one of the questions that my mum used to ask me. Said, when anybody asks me what you do, I've no idea what to say to them. The thrill engineer, I coined that phrase back in 2007 because there's a lot of what I do is very sort of objective, which is sort of thinking about emotions, thinking about the way we structure and create emotions in people, and the sort of subjective bit, the thrill bit, the emotions, is very much sort of a creative side. So I think it's a real reflection of that duality when we're thinking about entertainment, that we can learn so much by looking at it through a science lens and so much by looking at it through an arts and creative lens. And I just mash those two up. I think my career can really be summarized as a sort of always a juxtaposition between two positions of looking at something. So I generally get involved in consultancy for new rides and attractions. It's either helping to conceive, the new concepts, or right at the other end of the spectrum, helping to amplify and market new rides and attractions and experiences. And also day to day, I mean, we set up another company recently, Studio GoGo, where we create virtual reality for existing mechanical rides, so adding VR experiences to existing mechanical rides to give them a bit of a 21st century boost. So we own and operate, so we've got a lot of experience in owning and operating rides here in the UK. And in fact, we've been over to the States as well with a couple of our rides, touring them around.
So, Brendan, I'm curious if we could go back a little bit. Before we started recording, you talked about being an artist and, really, big installations and things like that. So how did that then transfer into being a thrill engineer and working in the attractions industry?
Well, I was originally trained as an aeronautical engineer. So I worked for British Aerospace military aircraft, actually, for 5 years in the UK. as an apprentice and also studying at Imperial College. And I kind of left, I mean, I had this sort of very sort of glamorous idea that, you know, working in that industry would literally be fast paced. But the aircraft I was coming in on, which was the Typhoon fighter at the time, was just coming off the end of the production line. The next fighter that they were looking at producing, I'd have retired by the time it actually took off. So I would never have seen a whole project all the way through. And it was moving, you know, at a snail's pace, 40 years from the conception through to the realization of a project. So I left and went to art school to retrain in industrial design. So I thought, well, maybe if I'm looking at products, there's a faster pace to this. And I went into college thinking I was going to come out designing white goods, you know, irons, kettles, fridges. I mean, that was super sexy to me. All I wanted to do is grab a magic marker and just draw things with this, what they called a farkle, which is this little bing, you know, on the corner where things are shiny. And I met somebody when I was at the Royal College of Art, an artist and designer called Tony Dunn. And he really opened my eyes up to sort of social and community-based art. And that is what I'd say, people at the center of design, you know, people-centric design. And I left university, the Royal College of Art, making pirate radio stations and hugely unemployable, with a massive skill set in engineering, which I'd abandoned. And very slowly, because of the, I think, slightly unusual people I was meeting, because I was making very bad pirate radio stations in the UK. They were micro broadcasting 200 meters. I mean, they were appalling. But the people I was meeting said, well, why don't we, for example, there was an architect who said, why don't we make a ride for this Cologne Art Fair? We've been commissioned to make something for BMW. Could we do something inside a car? And I said, well, let's make an installation based around J.G. Ballard's Crash. So this is where we took a car, we put hydraulic rams into the seats, and very slowly as you got into the car, it was all blacked out. There were strobe lights in there. Obviously, we had the whole speaker system. As there was a narration of J.G. Ballard's very graphic description of a crash and people's teeth being crushed into the dashboard, there was a hydraulic ram that very slowly crushed you as the rider against the dashboard, obviously within safe limits. And then the whole thing was over. It lasted 3 minutes. You got out, there was smoke, there were sirens, and it was hugely popular. And I started to realize that knowing engineering, knowing how to move people, you know, thinking on the scale of moving people through space safely was a real asset. So then I started making much larger mechanical sculptures, making electromechanical installations for museums like the Science Museum, which involved all sorts of rotating structures, moving conveyor belts with objects and things on them. Things most people would think were quite risky. And then I think it was that realization that there was an element of thrill in everything I did. There was this sort of emotional quality, and I was starting to move people, you know, through space. I was thinking, yeah, it really started to have all the language, even though I didn't even know it at the time. It had all the language of amusement parks, spectacle, rides, and I was kind of like in denial. In fact, the very first talk I ever gave about engineering thrill was at Tate Modern in London at a conference about designing emotions. And my whole manifesto was absolutely against the commodification of thrilling experiences. In fact, I had a few damning things to say about the theme park industry, how I'd never work for them. And, you know, real thrill seekers were more like wine connoisseurs. And there was a whole complexity to thrill seeking. And I wrote a small booklet, The Taxonomy of Thrill, which was about how, it was a kind of a blueprint, and it's still available, but it's how to design and create thrilling experiences. And also a little bit of science in the back, which I'm sure we'll come on to. There's a formula for thrill. But it was that booklet which then got the then studio manager of Merlin Magic Making, which was Tussauds Studios back at the time, ordered 13 copies for all their creative directors. and then invited me in as a visiting creative director to run future research projects for them. And I was going, you know what, maybe I have actually got something to say to this industry who I was so damning about. And they were like hugely excited by the things I had to say. And obviously, because I was challenging or being very provocative about the status quo in the amusement and attractions industry. So that was kind of like my journey, sort of a provocateur and troublemaker turned a complete lover and advocate for the industry.
It's so fascinating. I feel like there's so many different directions we can go from here and so much to unpack. I would love to talk about the emotional quality of thrill, and you talked about the formula of thrill. Can you expand on those a little bit?
Yeah. Well, I'd bring science into it. I'd always say, you know, because of the thrill laboratory and the thrill engineer, which is very much about the communication of the science, people get quite excited and fixated on that. And I would say science is a great lens to maybe bring either as inspiration at the start, or maybe, you know, the first 5%, or maybe the final 5% if you want to, if you created something brilliant and you want to refine it and tweak it, etc. So that said, there's a caveat, you know, there's a full 90% which creatives and people who are dedicated hard workers, that is, you know, territory which is indisputable. But the science bit, which really intrigued me, I said, both for inspiration and as a sort of a way to refine thrilling ideas, was based around, well, a very simple model I found about the way that designers describe, or psychologists describe emotions, that there are two dimensions to thrill, or rather, two dimensions to any emotion. There's arousal, which is adrenaline and your body being pumped up and ready for action. You know, your heart gets faster, your hands get sweaty, your pupils become dilated. And then there's another quality, which is called valence. I mean, that's what scientists call it. It's pleasure, whether we like something or not. And that's related to dopamine and the sense of euphoria. Now, there's a lot of science. I mean, at MIT, there's one particular group led by a scientist called Ros Pickard, who've done a lot of work in sort of monitoring emotions. This all is around an industry which is human-computer interaction, which, you know, Apple and Microsoft, they've all been doing for years, this whole area. But they always talked about the startle response, which is just the arousal side. And again, that is something when people talk about thrill, this was all part of my shtick. It was like, people talk about adrenaline junkies, about people going to extremes. I go, no, there's another quality. It's pleasure. You say the scientists call it the hedonistic tone. And I did a set of interviews around 2005 in a project called Chromo 11, because Chromo 11 is the where the thrill-seeking gene, the chromosome 11 is where the thrill-seeking gene D4DR lives. And so that was the name, this sort of placeholder for the project. I interviewed 50 people about their own thrilling experiences, everything from whitewater rafters, you know, extreme base jumpers, but then people who also reported being thrilled by knitting, by cross-dressing, by all sorts of unusual activities. So really out on the fringes and a lot of really core stuff. And without fail, they all reported that they felt what they described sensation of thrill when there was a sudden and a large increase in both pleasure and arousal at the same time. And so I did a little bit of digging and applied some of the engineering principles I'd looked at, and we sort of started looking at these qualities. And yeah, there's you can quantify thrill in terms of its pleasure and arousal. So the form of thrill, the Walker thrill factor, is there will be a massive and large increase in thrill if there's a massive and large increase in pleasure and arousal at the same time. It has to be big, it has to be fast. So that's the sort of science side. So constantly, if I'm thinking, God, how do I actually improve this? You know, how do I improve this moment? I'll always fall back on those two qualities. But then the question is, well, what do we have in our arsenal to actually start to play with those qualities? And, you know, again, looking at the interviews I conducted, there are 5 cornerstones that I will fall to as a creative practitioner, which are areas to do with sensation. So essentially, stimulating any of our senses. I mean, if we're talking about roller coasters and other thrill rides, we've clearly got sort of very sort of visceral sensations going on, but sound, taste, touch, all those elements. Then there's the spectacle, which is very much about questioning our sense of, well, our beliefs. So that's, we've got things like wonder and awe and magic playing into that category. Then we have power and control, and this can be related to gameplay. So, you know, it's whether our social standing, you know, if we're playing a game, are we winning? Are we taking part? Are people watching us? Do they think we're great? You know, roller coasters are fantastic performance venues. You know, you're not just having a ride, you're performing, you know, you're screaming, people are seeing you, your friends are seeing you. So there's that whole area. It's a very sort of social quality. And then the fourth one is, he said, scratching his head, going, what was the fourth one? Being valued. That's right. So again, this is, sorry, that was what we just talked about, being valued. The power and control, obviously, was the kinetic energy, the physical forces, being on top of a hill, etc. So that's power and control. Being valued was the social. The fifth one, well, I call immortality or mortality. It's not really immortality. Mortality, there's two aspects to this. One is both the avoidance of danger to life and limb. So this is very much about the whole work around the balance between risk against benefit. And then also there are things which will proliferate life: sating hunger, quenching thirst, having fulfilling sex. No surprise, they're all really thrilling things. And thrill, I mean, in a nutshell, is our evolutionary reward for the perseverance of human life on Earth. And that is it. You know, it's become a little bit more, I'd say, perverted and changed in the modern world, how we seek, how we get that reward. But that is the basic principle. And it isn't an emotion, it even precedes emotions. It is the change in emotional state from something which isn't very good to something which is really great. And if you can do that quickly, you're going to thrill someone.
Wow, I feel like I'm in college somewhere, right? And we're learning about this. And I know you're a professor, so we'll get into that here in just a little bit. But I'm wondering if we can maybe dive a little deeper into the process of doing this for so many different people as you're designing an attraction or designing an experience. Because as you mentioned, the thrill could be base jumping or it can be knitting. And where do you come to, you know, bring that together to say what's going to be thrilling for most people when they experience something?
Yeah. So and again, this was one of the things that I used to think about when I say the attractions and entertainment industry, was that it was, I kind of felt that it was both possibly unimaginative or didn't actually go to the extremes or probe the edges. And the more I interacted with people in the industry, I suddenly realized, no, that's not what's going on here. They're actually way better than I imagined. They're actually crafting something which will appeal to the 95th percentile. So as I say, you know, if I'm working with students or any other artist who are making something, go, look, I can do something which is really thrilling. It's going to be, we're going to throw you out the back of this thing, you're going to land in in some bubble bath, you're going to do this. I'm going, yeah, but maybe only like 2 out of 10 people want to do that. How about 9.5 out of 10 people want to do that? You're going, and how do you do that and actually make it feel incredibly special for everybody who, you know, have all got different psychological makeups? And, you know, I'll go back to one of the great guys. I mean, he's dead now, but Marvin Zuckerman, who was at Delaware Tech. I think he was, you know, he was one of the great grandfathers of thrill seeking. He understood thrill seeking metrics. He had this thing called the sensation seeking scale, and there were 4 elements on this. So any personality, you know, could be profiled in terms of thrill and adventure seeking, which is very much the adrenaline stuff I was talking about. The sensation seeking, which is more to do with the sort of magic and people who like theatre. There's susceptibility to boredom, which obviously we like to avoid. And then there's also a disinhibition category, which is whether you like to be a public performer or not. And you can score people, you know, on a 0 to 10 basis. So we suddenly got like a 40-point scale, and any of us could have a real mixture of all these different responses. So you go, and that's just like a simple kind of scale. So you think like 95% of people coming through a gate with all these complex behaviors and psychological profiles, where do you start? And that's like, okay, that's where you go, I have no idea. I think you know, I would always start with empathy. So I don't think it's possible to start with market surveys of going, these are our target profiles. I mean, you can roughly, you know, to try and imagine, or rather, let's say I'm sat in a room with other creative directors. That kind of marketing data, who is our audience, may give us the archetypes, the types of people, you know, a handful of people. It's a family unit. It's a group of friends with one person who may be a wheelchair user. It's, you know, a mixed group of, you know, mom and pop, grandma, granddad, really young kids. And then it's taking that journey and being able to empathize and also live vicariously through that group's eyes about what may be appealing. So I think there's certainly an element of imagination and theatre which comes into this, being able to play out scenes in your mind, storyboard, discuss, you know, and really imagine what these people will be feeling and sensing through that. So, yeah, I think statistics get you so far, but it is that sense of being able to empathize, which will really start to get you able to interrogate and to assess the ideas as they start to evolve.
How much is the pre-experience and the post-experience factored in that when looking at empathizing or living vicariously through their behaviors, through their emotions? I'd say that the pre-experience, if I'm waiting in line for a ride, right, it's building that anticipation, it's second guessing myself, right, it's getting anxious, it's getting nervous, for maybe that, for many individuals. And then afterwards, kind of just giving the example of that family, are they closer together, right? Have they bonded? What happens, after it happens? I'm curious as far as just how much that goes into the full process. Yeah.
So I think particularly on the rides and experiences that I've produced, which are, you could probably term, well, if they're not Studio Go-Go, which are much more embedded in parks and attractions, that we'd recognize. The other experiences I've created, more experimental pieces, have been more in an art context, as in they'll be temporary, they're set up at festivals for 3 or 4 days. But nevertheless, those dynamics you're talking about are exactly the same. They're location-based visitor attractions. People have been seeded with the idea 6 months before. They've imagined going, well, shall we go? Shall we go? Who's going to go? Let's book it. You're going, that's a moment to thought, well, we're actually going to go. Then there's the countdown to that moment. So it's all those touch points, in advertising, we'll talk about, each one of those times, whether it's the posters, the receiving of the tickets, whether they're digital or whatever, it's the journey there. Each of those has its own thrilling potential possible. So, some of the rides I've done in the past, so I'm very keen to get involved in the design of the ticketing, the poster design, so that whole marketing experience. So even before there, let's say in our live space, our park. And then in the park itself, it's I think one of the great things, having been involved in the conception of rides at an early stage, was having the marketing directors going, show me give us a drawing of what the press are going to be showing in their newspapers. Again, you haven't even designed the ride yet, but what's that going to look like? Because that image there is going to be the one that sells it into the press, that sells it into the public, that seeds the idea of just how exciting this is. What's the nugget? What are the 2 lines? Why is this ride so special? How are people going to get it? What's going to excite them? So constantly, even just as you're conceiving the idea, that visitor journey and what those touch points are going to be, where people are going to stand and go, wow, look at that, or in the queue with, with the ride whipping past them. And obviously, well, I'll come on to souvenirs in a moment, but so that whole pre-stage of anticipation is really critical. And I think the granularity of anticipation goes, say, from months to weeks, to days, to hours, to minutes, to, let's say, the microseconds of even being locked into a ride. I did a study on Oblivion at Alton Towers, and we found that the levels of arousal of the ride itself, and this was the world's first vertical drop over vertical drop roller coaster, the level of arousal of actually being locked into the seat, the drop feature itself only reached 80% of that moment. And that was like incredible. Somebody's really done their job incredibly well to sell that as being probably like one of the most terrifying things that anybody wants to do. So much so that you're going, I can't escape. And, and I think that's amazing, that moment too. So I think those steps, as I say, that granularity, changing scale is critical to understanding that journey. But then we get this lovely effect afterwards, which I'm really interested in, particularly with work with visitors of mixed ability who may not, some may get on a ride, some may not. It's how do you continue that journey beyond the ride? And I'm thinking about rides as islands of experience within a park where there'll be multiple experiences, obviously you're moving between, and there's this sense of afterglow. So, in chemical terms, the people who've been on the ride are awash with adrenaline and dopamine. They have this like euphoric effect, which I term the afterglow. For some people, it can last for minutes. Other people report it lasting for hours. And during that time, you've got some energy you can play with, whether it's merchandising, going, you need this because obviously it's going to capture your experience and you can relive your moments again and again. So in a sense, it's both the service and, upselling in some ways. There's the whole sort of souvenir and merchandising. But then it's the conversations and the walking. So I love Alton Towers for that reason, that it's within parkland. There is a fair distance between various zones. And there is time for decompression and reflecting and talking. And I think that's, I don't think you can't go from thrill to thrill and not A, be exhausted, and B, become desensitized. So there is that, and I think value can be built between those islands, as I say, with sort of strengthening thoughts and memories and bonds between people. So yeah, it's the fairground showmen have a term for this. British fairground showmen. There's an old Romany term called the tober, Tober, which describes the way in which a fairground showman will piece together the small rides of games of chance at the front, the midway, the flat rides in the middle, the big white knuckle rides at the back. There is no set way of moving through this, but there is a sense of building anticipation, building up to the big, finale at the end, and allowing space. I think it's a little bit like a Pachenko machine. You've dropped people through this area, they can find their own way through, and ultimately they will get to that big finale at the end. How they find their way through is kind of like always a sort of, it's variable. I mean, you can try and funnel people, but they're all personal, individual journeys. And I think individuals are the most excellent curators of their own experience, given a landscape of possibilities.
Yeah. One of the things I'm curious about, Brendan, is you're talking about these emotions and the way we process these experiences is, you're talking about these thrills and things that, as you're describing them, for most people would be positive. But is there a negative side to that emotion that people might feel, or something that says, I don't want to do that, or maybe even a haunt where you're actually scared, where there's obviously arousal and maybe a different kind of pleasure as you're going through a haunted experience?
Yes, and it's intriguing when people, I get asked, where is the thrill, particularly when it comes to Halloween? you know, where is the thrill in being, or the entertainment in being scared? And why would I do that? I mean, it's a really interesting space. Well, let's take something that isn't, let's say, horror themed, but which something is generally looks uncomfortable or beyond our our comfort zone, let's say, for example. So there's a psychologist in the 1940s, Donald Hebb. He had this graph of the optimum level of arousal theory, which kind of like showed it was a bell upside down sort of bell graph. And, you know, if a ride's going faster and faster, it'll generally get more pleasurable. Then you reach a point where you're going, it just doesn't feel right. I'm starting to feel a bit queasy or whatever. And so you want it to go a bit slower. So this is optimum speed. But also at the same time, there's this flat line which is shooting up, which is your level of risk. And if you perceive, you know, so this is like the risk benefit thing. So as the ride goes faster, you think, well, as the Edwardians thought, over 7 miles an hour, my arms and legs will fly off. You know, okay, we get 7 miles an hour. That's not happened. You're going more and more up. And if the your perception of risk outweighs the perceived reward or the sensation, then it starts. Then you want to retreat from whatever it is you're doing. So, for a lot of people, the profile of those two curves, you know, is very different, and where they intersect is very different. But the real trick for a ride is the perception of risk and the real risk. So you can actually make the perceived risk, a marketing trick, to be much greater. You make the real risk much less. And this is where visitors coming into a theme park setting, there's an unwritten contract that happens on your entry into a theme park, where you say, I'm willing to give myself over to you. It's a bit like going to live theatre. I know you've thought through a whole bunch of stuff. I know I'm safe. Somebody's designed this. It's a bit like going to an experimental restaurant going, this looks crazy, but somebody's thought through this. I'm sure it's going to taste great because these guys are going to make great rides, whatever, you know, so I'm going to go with it. And you think, right, I'm going to allow them to take me into this gray spot of where it is uncomfortable, but I know ultimately they're not going to push me over the threshold. And so it's playing. There's a psychologist called Michael Apter who wrote a book called The Dangerous Edge, and it is about experimenting with where that edge is and looking over the side and feeling your heart going. And there's a whole level of sort of catharsis involved with that, but also a lot of evolutionary advantage for exploration and going to that edge and pushing yourself just that bit further. And that's where thrill lives, and that will make you feel hugely alive. So that explains some of the sort of riskier things, pushing yourself that you really wouldn't want to do. I mean, clearly there are some people whose profiles would preclude them from going on various things because they know they might feel sick, they know they really don't like fast rides, or they don't want to look stupid. And that's fine. They can hold the coats, they can take the photographs, but obviously we need to think about those people and what they're going to get in that sort of contract. And then there are themes, you say, ghost attractions, let's say haunted attractions, dark rides. There's nothing scarier than going on a British, or probably touring your carnival circuits as well, on an old ghost train and knowing that there's a real operator who's going to touch you at some point. Grab your knee. They're going, yeah, you can have all the most fantastic effects, but if there's a human, is kind of like stalking you, it's just not nice. I mean, I don't know, but it just makes me laugh with hysterics. And I think there's a sort of uncomfortableness as well about that kind of social dynamics and storytelling and disbelief, which again, I think a little bit like listening to fairy tales, you kind of want to go to those darker places to see what it feels like. But ultimately, in 3 minutes, you're going to be spat out at the other end, much more enriched and a happier person.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that just reminded me of a walkthrough attraction I did a couple of weeks ago where it said our actors are permitted to touch you. And I thought, well, my fear level just went way up, my comfort level just went down. But like you said, when you walk into a theme park, you have this unwritten contract that you turn yourself over to. I think that's such a fascinating way of looking at it. I would love to know, you were recently part of an excellent panel interview on NPR regarding the safety of thrill rides and roller coasters. I thought there were so many amazing points shared by you alongside the other panelists. And the interview was about really kind of reassurance, I would say, to the general public when they're visiting parks, when they're riding rides and attractions. Curious as far as some of your top points that that you made in that interview that that you'd like to share with our audience as well.
Yeah. Well, I think that the first one was what a brilliant mode of failure that was. I mean, if you're going to want something to fail, it's got to fail positive, you know, and that sense that if something's going wrong, I mean, thank goodness for Henry Miller and his understock wheels for starters. I mean, I designed the world's first inverting playground slide, which used only centripetal force to keep somebody on the inside of the curve. And that was for a TV show in the UK. And we kind of like know what happens if you fall out of a curve. So, you know, the first real takeaway was those safety features really worked brilliantly. And that is the mode of failure you want to happen. And secondly, you know, we're in this space, and I touched on it earlier, where theme parks and attractions, particularly ones that want to make you feel that you're going to that dangerous edge, but we're not in reality. So we are trading as an industry on this ambiguous gray area where we're asking people, we're saying, you're doing something really heroic, you're going on the fastest, the tallest, the most loops, and you know, and you will come out this real heroes. And then they're going, oh wow, we're actually, you know, right on the edge of like cutting edge rides, and we don't know what's going to happen. And then when the ride, you know, something like this happens, you go, oh, actually, no, it's incredibly safe. You're going, oh no, look at this other bit of the curve. We were actually hiding from you. And no wonder that the press and the public are going, no, you told us we're like living on the edge, and look at these people like on the edge here. And you go, well, actually, no, it's incredibly safe because we were, you know, this is part of the unwritten contract. It's actually behind the scenes. It's all incredibly safe. So I think in those terms, you suddenly see where the tension comes from. The press are still playing on the story of, well, they're still inside the experience. They're still going, this is really dangerous. This is like high adrenaline, blah, blah, blah. And you're going, well, actually, no, these people have stopped. And it's more like a processing plant. At that point, I'm going, this is like a robotics processing lamp. All the interlocks have happened. These guys are safe. It's uncomfortable, clearly. Nobody ever wants this to happen. But look, it was resolved safely. So I think it comes down to that theatre. And once you understand that, and the way that as an industry we both utilize, I suppose we have a symbiotic relationship with the media, the marketing and press. Equally, you know, they'll want to continue their story when something goes wrong, and that's kind of understandable. But which is why the NPR show was brilliant, because in the UK, when there was an accident on the Smiler at Alton Towers, it took, because I've been heavily involved in the marketing of that ride a few years earlier. The phone started ringing 6 minutes after the story broke, and I was going, I'm not answering that because nobody in the industry is going to thank me for any kind of knee-jerk responses, etc. Whereas, and it was quite right. I mean, all these stories I knew were going to be on that with that flavour, but the NPR story, I realised they gave it some time. They were clearly gathering together some people from the industry who were, who had some insights, real insights to bring to this. And I think they did an excellent job, and it was great to be amongst such great company, looking at it from a very sort of sober perspective, you know, from an industry perspective.
So, Brendan, one of the things I'm curious about is you obviously have a deep well of knowledge and passion for what you do. But I'm sure there's other people out there that say, I want to be a thrill engineer. I want to do that. I want to design roller coasters and all these experiences. What advice do you have for people that might be interested in pursuing a career like that?
Well, I mean, you were very good. Actually, that was a question you pinged over to me earlier, because I knew I was expecting this, and I was going, it's one sense it's hard, but I always think about the people I've come across I go, wow, you are amazing in this field. And they tend to come from two types of categories. There's either the super specialist. Now, in that, I mean, if you want to be an engineer, that's great. That's sort of like applied science and physics. But if you really want to become a specialist, become a physicist, become a theoretical physicist. You know, that is your initial passion. Then move on to its application. And you will have, you know, same with mathematics. So you can become quite pure, but still go, I want to work in that industry. But having that depth of knowledge, you will be in huge demand. The second area I'd say would be the design creative industries. So designer, artist, architect. Not only have you got the lateral thinking, so rather than taking the deep dive, we're looking at making lateral connections. So anybody who's used to communicating with interdisciplinary teams, so being able to talk the language of everybody, understand all those components, understand how the collective forms something which is greater than any individual could make. All those kind of disciplines work really well. And the third one is, you know, anything which deals with time-based media. So animation, film, live performance. I think there's a really interesting crossover between live performance. If you look at companies like Punch Drunk in the UK, who, you know, often get, or, you know, Meow Wolf as well, who get involved in sort of very much stuff which is more sort of pre-show, dark show type of stuff. There's a real interplay there, but time-based media is also. So I think any of those, I mean, actually, and if you were time-based media, I'd always say to somebody, you'll never go wrong if you study history, because you're going to be able to structure stories, tell great stories, and that'll always stand you in good stead. And again, from that, then you can go into the more creative. So I think it's get a real bedrock in those areas, but never lose sight of where you're going to apply that ultimately. Get your specialism.
Excellent. Brendan, before we started recording, we all acknowledged that the most difficult part of the interview would be finding where to end it and how to end it, because I feel like we could just keep talking for quite a long time. I can think of so many more questions that I want to ask you, so maybe we'll have to have you back sometime for part 2. Out of respect for your time and for our audience as well, if people want to get a hold of you directly, or if they want to know more about Studio GoGo or Thrill Laboratory, where would you send them?
So yeah, if you want to know more about Thrill Laboratory, go to www.thrilllaboratory.com, Thrill Laboratory, all one word. So there you can see more about the science and the experimental side. If you want to know more about my work creating rides and VR experiences, go to studiogogo.com. So studiogogo, all one word, .com. And you'll be able to pick up my email address and contact me directly from either of those two.
Excellent. Well, Brandon, thank you so much for your time today. It was so fascinating to hear all the things about emotions and thrills. And I echo what Josh said. We could have you back for 2 or 3 more episodes. But thank you again for your time. And for everybody out there who is watching and listening, just remember, we are all Attraction Pros. Thanks for listening to the Attraction Pros podcast.
Make sure to subscribe so you can tune in when new episodes release. And even better, please leave us a review on iTunes.
For more information, visit attractionpros.com.